Okay, I'm going to kick off. For those of you, I think I know everyone in the room, but I'm Kevin Haggerty at the University of Alberta, and I'm going to be talking about Irsp Iii, surveillance consequences of 9/11, which I'm sort of I don't know what the term is, co-organizing, co-coordinating with Arthur Caulfield here at the co-team leader here at the at Queen's University. I just want to start with just communicate something. When the Twin Towers fell down, when they collapsed, my wife was a couple months pregnant. And in the months and years that have followed, my son has been born. He's learned to walk. He's learned to talk. He went to daycare. He's gone to school. He's finishing kindergarten this year. He's become an Oilers fan. In all of that time, this is where the Irish in me gets a little uncomfortable, that deep, suspicious, that deep Irishman who hides inside of me gets a little nervous. But in all that time, there's not been another major attack on mainland North America. But September 11th has become an inescapable referent for all kinds of phenomena, political, social, technological. It's just something that we cannot avoid. And there's certainly a problem of periodization when we start to frame an IRSP or anything in terms of post 9/11. One of the first things that a lot of us pointed to was that all of this post 9/11 stuff, rather than thinking of rupture, I think you had to think also about continuity. There's a lot of things that started pre 9/11 and have continued, perhaps become intensified. But continuity is important here as well. Nonetheless, the idea of rupture, the idea of a fundamentally different moment, political status, post 9/11 has been continually, repeatedly invoked by some very major institutional, organizational, and political players who are very keen to bring about a whole range of important changes. So in some levels, the rhetoric has been vital and has been key, and that's one of the things we'd like to try and look at. At the broadest level, we're interested in the role in which surveillance plays broadly in dynamics of security, securitization, post 9/11, with obvious continuities prior to that. I think it connects, Sherry would mention the connection yesterday between security studies and surveillance. I mean, this is probably the closest connection of all of these groups. We're interested in dynamics of security. And surveillance has, because I don't have to tell people in this room, surveillance has become one of the dominant ways in which major organizational interests have tried to respond to a whole series of terrorist security threats, from biometrics to new documentary regimes, all kinds of high-tech security devices have been marshaled in trying to deal with this threat. And what we're really trying to deal with is the question of, well, what's going on here? And what's going on at a whole series of different levels. One of them, I think, is legally, and this is one that Art might speak to in a second, or one, post 9/11, there was a whole series of legal regimes that were passed to try and empower a whole range of new surveillance, visibility kinds of practices. In the last few years, we've seen alternative legal regimes trying to perhaps curtail, try and rein in some of those practices. It remains unclear how effective those legal regimes have been. One of the other, I think, really interesting sort of dynamics related to law and surveillance pertains to issues around privacy, and particularly how post 9/11 privacy and secrecy have become the purview of major organizations that invoke questions of privacy and secrecy not to tell us what they're doing, often when they're monitoring us. So there's been, I think, this interesting change in the dynamics of security, privacy, and secrecy that I think play themselves out quite well on many domains, but particularly post 9/11. Sort of a second question, a second level at which we're interested in exploring the what's going on question is institutionally. Connects probably closest to Irsp Iii. Who are the major players in this game? And those can include security operatives. Is it the CSIS in Canada? Is it the RCMP? Is it Transport Canada? Who are the major institutions that are involved in this game? And what are the connections across them, nationally and internationally? How can we map those? How can we understand them? Third sort of level of what's going on is cross-institutionally. How is it, and this perhaps connects closest to Irsp II, how is it that information is moving across institutions? How is it that the walls are becoming more permeable? Is information being securitized? To what extent? How is it that security agencies are able to access all manner of information, consumer data, et cetera, in profiling practices? So what's happening cross-institutionally? How is it that different levels and different orders of phenomena, information, paper trails, technologies are held together, coordinated, pointed in particular directions? Fourth level of interest is at the at the level of governmental logics. How is it that governance is conceived in these areas where there's been a lot of talk about risk, and I've sort of contributed to some extent to that literature. How is it that surveillance is connected with understandings of risk? There's also been new talk about thinking about the move to precaution, and how is it that post 9/11, famously the 9/11 Commission sort of said one of the major failings of the security establishment was a failure of imagination. They didn't think in wildly implausible kinds of ways, and how this has introduced a new security logic of almost Disney-esque Imagineering to the security establishment, to try and continually institutionalize, which is impossible, thinking outside of the box. But there's been this new attempt to move beyond risk, which is calculable, which is statistical often. And increasingly, we also hear talk about a different governmental logic, something I've called precaution, something other people have called preemption, and the inescapable referent to Minority Report, trying to anticipate things. And I think it's an open question whether this is just an academic fixation at this point, or how concretely this is actually playing itself out on the ground. I think that remains an open question. So I think that's one of the things we're interested in. And the fifth and final one I wanted to mention was we're interested in the experiential dimension of this. How is it that this is playing out in people's lives? And this connects across all the IRSPs. How is it, and this is very hard to get to, how is it that new security dynamics affect things such as, as David Lyon has talked about, social sorting, people's life chances, life opportunities? How is it that people relate when they go through customs to these security types of processes? What are the racializing practices of this? They're simply unavoidable post 9/11. How is it that these different effects materialize themselves across different races and different ethnicities and different ages, et cetera? We have some data about that, and Queen's has been very good about producing some excellent studies in this. We need a lot more, because one of the things I think, at least speaking personally, one of the things that I would like to see come out of this over a 7-year period, this whole project, is more broadly empirical kinds of studies. And empirical can be coded in any number of different ways. Discourse analysis, interviews, statistical studies, whatever the case may be. Gary Marks often rails against, that this field does a lot of talk but doesn't do a lot of research, and sometimes I identify with that. I think we need to actually go out and find out what's going on, particularly in this domain, because just about anyone who's done active research, for example, in security agencies, finds out that stuff doesn't work, that we have these dystopian fears that the technology will actually be perfectly materialized and it will work and that it'll fulfill all of its technological capabilities. My friend and colleague Peter Manning, for sort of 15 years, has been railing against this through repeated empirical studies of the police that show, they have multi-million-dollar communication infrastructures, and they don't use them, they don't like them, they phone each other on their cell phones. Technologies don't talk to one another, they're using different operational systems. So I think we just need to get into the nitty-gritty of how does this work? How is it that it's made to work? What are its limitations? What are its failures? How do we understand those practices? Personally, I think that another dynamic related to the experiential dimension is a broader issue that I've become increasingly interested in, is dynamics of trust. How is it that personal experiences of trust, oh, you're ticking your clock, eh, David? Okay. How is it that personal experiences of trust change as we move to new technologies, new security kinds of technologies? Very quickly, all of these IRSPs are connected. I see this one perhaps as the one where there's the strongest confluence. You cannot talk about conflict zones and population management without talking about post 9/11. I think I read something maybe a week ago was talking about how, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, 50 to 60% of the Homeland Security budget in the United States goes to border control. So if you're talking population management, you're talking post 9/11. Technology companies, obviously, there's a huge connection post 9/11. Cyber surveillance, how is it that is it true that all of our information has the possibility to move to security agencies? How would that actually happen? Just in terms of the outputs, this is, we're aiming for which would probably be a fairly high profile workshop on September 9th and 10th, 2011. So we're looking at 10 years after 9/11 conference. We're also going to be holding a workshop. This isn't directly with this IRSP, but relatedly the one on the surveillance games just in advance of the Winter Olympics. I think we're talking about November. And that obviously, the fears, the imaginations that drive a lot of security issues are terrorist related. So I think David was giving me the hook. Did you want to add anything quickly, Eric? Or?
How much time do I have, David?
Oh no!
Well,
no, I'm the mouthpiece. I'm unlike Lorene. I'm not afraid to speak for the others.
well, here's the other right now speaking a little bit. You know, because Kevin started off with a story about 9/11, I thought I'd offer my own story and how this phenomena, the terrorist attack of 9/11, still seemed to be so embedded in our imagination, seemed to animate so many of the laws to ostensibly promote security. I had been I'm Canadian, but I had been out of Canada for about 6 years, and 2 weeks prior to 9/11, I moved back to take my job here at Queen's, and at that time my spouse was pregnant with our third child, and note the relative productivity of the two collaborators here. Anyhow, so we landed back in Canada, and then the terrorist attack occurred, and I just recall remembering really for the first time in my life being so angry at the loss of all of these innocent lives and just being absolutely furious. Had never really experienced these feelings before. We have family, you know, in New York and elsewhere. And I was quite concerned. And so I thought, you know, somebody hand me a machine gun, send me into Kandahar. I was that livid. It was really upsetting. And so I can understand the public's reaction to a lot of these developments. And of course, as Canadian researchers, we have to always keep in mind that our own country has yet to be attacked. There's at least some suspicion that some folks may be trying to attack us, but we haven't been attacked, and that really does affect much of our thinking on these issues. But despite my anger, I think over time I came to reflect on a lot of the developments, in particular a lot of the laws that were rammed through our Parliament in December of 2001, the Anti-Terrorism Act, Bill C-36. And my research started to focus more and more on whether or not we've struck the appropriate balance, or even if that's the right way to think about these issues. And I often think, when I started that research agenda, I often try to keep in mind the comments of a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Justice Brandeis, who back in 1928, in the case called Olmstead, where Mr. Olmstead was wiretapped by the U.S. Government. He had been running booze illegally in from Canada to the U.S., and the legal issue was, did the police need to get a warrant before using the wiretap. And Brandeis, in a dissent, he lost the case. He said, yes, of course, we have to be very careful about these new surveillance technologies. But the comment that I always try to keep in mind is his view that the greatest threat to liberty is the intent of well-meaning men of zeal, and perhaps today we would add well-meaning men and women of zeal. But I think that that's very true and very relevant to this particular IRSP. As Kevin mentioned, we're going to try to get a better fundamental understanding of what is actually taking place. How do citizens feel about these legal changes? And in fact, I think a lot of our research is going to build on the GPD survey that Elia supervised. If you look at a lot of the findings within that survey, they suggest that a majority of citizens who were surveyed in different countries don't think the government has struck the appropriate balance between new laws to enhance police powers and also trying to preserve our fundamental civil liberties, such as the right to privacy. And so that's what we'll look into. Is it, in fact, the case that citizens feel like that certain citizens, in particular, identifiable groups, obviously Muslim Canadians, is it true that they feel like they're under scrutiny despite no evidence of individual wrongdoing? Is this leading to other consequences such as social alienation? Are they more reluctant now to assist the authorities? Have police practices changed in a material way because of these new powers that have been given to them by our country and, of course, many other countries throughout the world? And I think it's important to try to step back and empirically assess what exactly is taking place. It's particularly important for the law. There's an ongoing legal battle throughout the world, at least in Canada, the UK, the US, Australia, I'm aware of. My colleague Sherry Aiken is a part of this battle, challenges to this new legal regime that's been put in place in the post-9/11 world. And we have a lot of arguments within the legal literature, within the sociological literature, lots of claims about how people feel, how the police have changed, but we don't really have a fundamental understanding, at least to my knowledge, of what is taking place. And so by assessing this through surveys, through focus groups or some other methodologies, the hope is that we'll get a more fundamental understanding of what's taking place, and this will help all of our research agendas. And in particular, the hope is that it'll have a public policy outcome that will lead to better laws. And in particular, one of the devices I think that has been very helpful for many of us to think about it is to get away from this notion of balance, that we need to reduce privacy to enhance our security. And in the legal literature in the last few years, we've seen a reversal, and courts in Canada and elsewhere are starting to buy into this notion that, in fact, privacy has a social value. Colin Bennett and Chris Regan and our other research collaborator, Charles Robb, have written extensively about these issues. But to the extent we understand privacy as a social or a public value that needs to be preserved to maintain a vibrant democracy, to preserve the right to political dissent, to freedom of expression, the right to be free of racial or religious discrimination, and so on, I think maybe the empirical research can feed into those arguments and show, if it's true, that in fact we may be heading to a place that Brandeis warned us about. So those are my comments.